Hello, in this screencast presentation, I'm going to be giving a basic introduction to data analysis and presentation. I'm going to be discussing data analysis, data presentation techniques, and also signposting you to additional support if you want to follow up with some more specialist sessions around different elements of data analysis and presentation. This presentation won't be covering statistical analysis, but there is an accompanying short presentation provided for that purpose. Before getting into the specifics of data analysis and presentation, just want to remind you that of the wider picture in terms of the research process. So we're discussing an element of the research process today, but it fits within this bigger picture that's represented as this process diagram here. So the research process is cyclical. It starts off with a research aim, and then in order to explore your research aim, you design some methods and methodology, which we've already discussed in a previous presentation. And then you, using the methods that you've identified, you go and gather data. And then you analyze your data, present the findings, and the findings should address your research aim. So you're always thinking about bringing the research back to those research aims. And it's important to hold those research aims in mind when you're thinking about the ways in which you analyse and present data. Before deciding on your analysis strategy, it's important to think about the following questions. What is the question you're trying to answer? So that relates back to that idea of the research aims or the research objectives. What is it that this data that you have gathered is actually trying to do? How does the data answer the question? Are there any uncertainties that you need to account for? Have you made any assumptions that you need to account for or recognise? And is there any other additional information that you need in order to be able to convincingly and robustly answer your research questions? So your data analysis strategy and the way in which you decide to present your findings are very much determined by the type of data that you've got. So you could have been carrying out research that produced qualitative data or quantitative data, or perhaps even spatial data. So there are examples of two different formats of data, raw data here. So the top image is of a coded transcript, which is a method that we discussed in a previous presentation, and the bottom image is a data table. So depending on the type of research that you've done, you could have carried out interviews, in which case you'd have something that looked a bit like the top image, or you could have done a numerical survey, a quantitative survey, in which case you might have a data table like the bottom. Or you could have done spatial analysis, in which case you might have data that's visualized in a sort of map form. For each of these different types of data gathering processes and the shape of the data that you produce, there are different appropriate kinds of data analysis that you might want to think about. So some of the questions you might want to ask yourself are, do you need to do statistical tests? Now, we're not going to be discussing statistics in this presentation, but there's an accompanying presentation you can look out for that. But are you thinking about producing inferential statistics when you infer bigger patterns from the data that you've gathered, or descriptive statistics when you describe the shape of the data that you've produced? Will you be using coding, which we just showed an example of on the previous slide, for transcripts or for documentary analysis or content analysis? Will you be producing maps? Will you be producing graphs, different shapes of graphs, pie charts, bar charts, that kind of thing? The question of which method of data analysis to choose is really determined by what you think is the most effective way of analysing your data. There are always a number of different options that you could think about. So there is never going to be a single right way to do it. We can't tell you what right way you should choose, but there will probably be ways that are not as effective or that will be considered the wrong way of analysing your data. It's important to remember that you are learning these processes and learning these techniques, and the best way to find your way through this is by looking at different options and discussing your plans and proposals with your appropriate tutor. When thinking about data presentation, often people fall into the trap of thinking they have to display every single element of data that they've gathered, and that's not the case. So you may have gathered a large quantity data, and actually now what you have to decide is how you're going to prioritize key findings in the way that you present your data. There are lots of different methods that you can use. So you can use things like graphs and charts that, especially if you're working with numerical data in programs like Excel, they will generate. You can use those to generate graphs automatically. You can also do that in a number of different survey softwares that are available. Will actually sort of do some data analysis and present your findings in graph form. You can customize those standard forms of graphs and charts and have a think about how you can maybe tailor them to make them more effective at highlighting and prioritizing your key findings. Are you looking at spatial data and presenting that using things like Google Maps or Digimaps or a GIS software? So if you're doing a spatial analysis and you're wanting to show where things are happening, then using a map is the best way of doing that. Are you likely to produce a structured narrative account? So in other words, maybe you have carried out some interviews or you've carried out some observation, and actually there's a story. So when we use the term narrative, it's around telling the story of your findings using sort of written descriptions of your research findings. And I've said structured here because, again, we're thinking about how you can use different techniques to highlight and prioritize what it is about your data that you most want to foreground, that you most want to promote as being your key findings. What we don't want is a table listing every data value you collected, or pages and pages of uncoded or even coded transcripts where it's just, you don't want the person who's reading your report to have to sift through and interpret that data themselves. So you always going through a process of refining, analysing and producing a kind of succinct summary of the key findings, the best bits from your data analysis process. So the type of data that you gathered will really sort of help to determine how you present the data. So if you have numerical data, then it would suggest, you're not going to do a written account, a written description of numerical data. So you'd be looking at some kind of graph, bar chart, line graph, scatter graph, that kind of thing. If you have spatialized data, then again, it doesn't make any sense to produce a written description of that, or even to produce a sort of bar chart or a pie chart, because what's important about spatialized data is where things are happening. And therefore, really, you're thinking about using a map format for the presentation of that kind of data. And then you've got to think about things like the scale of the map that's appropriate, the type of symbology that you'd be using on the map, so how you're actually going to represent the data on the map. You could be using data tables, categories and totals to provide not just raw data, but actually like a summarized version in a table form. Or again, you could be using coded transcripts, documents. So that's where you have more kind of qualitative, wordy data format. And that way you like to be, as I say, producing kind of narrative summaries. But you can also, if the way that you're coding and sorting and analysing your qualitative data is to do things like maybe count the number of times a particular topic comes up, or count the number of times a particular use of terminology, then you can also produce counts. You can also turn that into numerical counts and use some of the graphs and tables as a way of summarising and presenting that data too. The most important thing to ask yourself when presenting your data is how clear are your key findings, because that's really whatever method you choose, it is all about highlighting and prioritizing your key findings. So these should be visible. It should be easy to see what the main findings are. And this is really where you have to decide how much of your data you're going to include in your findings and how much you're going to visualize. Sometimes people want to show everything that they've discovered, and in doing so, you can actually lose some of those key messages. So think about the hierarchy of your findings. What is most important? What is most important in order to help you meet your research aims and objectives? And make sure that you use those research aims and objectives to structure the way that you present your findings. And that's so that it's clear to the person reading it how you've actually completed that research journey back to the beginning, which is to return to the research aims. So to demonstrate maybe how sometimes visualizations can go a bit wrong, I'm going to show you now some examples of data visualization that could be improved. In terms of clarity of main message, it's really important for the person who's looking at your data visualization to really get what it is that the key message is. And that's where just reporting findings often needs some kind of interpretation. So this visualization here is kind of supposed to be talking about the relationship between these two sets of data. So how many timetable sessions students have attended, and if they've missed a session, do they catch up on the work? So what's slightly confusing here is how you can kind of understand the relationship between the graph on the left and the graph on the right. What's it actually saying to us? Are we able to get some kind of clear interpretation of what the picture is there? It will take quite a long time to do that. You can get there eventually, but there's a lot of assumptions being made. There's lots of bits missing here in terms of clarity of data. And it's actually hard to see what the overall picture is from these, the way that the data's been visualized. So here's another example, a pie chart. Pie chart should be one of the clearest ways of visualizing data. They are used obviously to show proportions, but what we have here in terms of this food origins pie chart is just too much information, and it gets to the point where it's like almost blurred. So what the main message here is, I think, that the UK produces 50% of the food and that we consume in the country in this year, 2007. And then maybe some headlines there, but actually you start to lose what's the point? What's the message here? Too much information crammed into one space, and it's not the message gets lost. So the opposite of too much information is too little information. And although this is a very simplistic example, there have been times when people don't label their axes or explain what data is or explain the scale that we're looking at. So do make sure that if you're going to use a data visualization technique like this, that you label the axes. So what do the numbers along the bottom represent? What do the numbers along the vertical axes represent? What is this graph showing us? So always include label your axes, and also label your diagram. So include a figure caption to explain what it is that we're seeing. Back to too much information again. This is somebody who is not prepared to let go of some of the complexity, or maybe should have chosen a number of different charts and instead has crammed everything onto one. It's almost impossible to understand. I mean, we haven't chosen a subject that's particularly clear anyway, but there's just too much information here, too many different, we can't even read the numbers at the top there. It's very hard to interpret. We don't know what the things in the key are. That's some highly technical language that's being used here, but this is another example of far too much data crammed onto one table. And here we are again with lack of clarity. So when you have to, I mean, we've chosen examples here from areas that will not be familiar to you, but with a data visualization like this, even somebody who isn't a specialist in the subject should be able to understand basically what we're looking at. What is this graphic trying to communicate to us? And this one has a number of different issues in terms of the symbology that's been used here. So the different markers on the different lines are all a little bit too close to each other in places. It's hard to distinguish them, and it's hard to get an overall picture of what the data is showing us. Again, too much happening in one space. But data overkill doesn't only happen in the presentation of numerical data. If you are using a narrative account method of describing the shape of the data or telling the story that the data tells, then you'll be using a form of written summary. But this is an example of a kind of stream of consciousness. And it's very hard you can read it, but actually it's just a data dump. It's not actually interpreting anything. It's not telling us what the analytical views of the researcher are here. It's just a stream of consciousness dump of everything that was observed. So if you are using this kind of method of presenting your data, really think about how you can structure using things like subheadings and tables to highlight and identify what the key findings are. What is it that you're trying to draw the reader's attention to? What did you discover through this method? So that again just means, making sure that your key findings aren't lost in whatever format that you're using to present your data. So that was a short whistle-stop tour through some of the sort of basic principles. But if you want to explore data analysis and presentation at a deeper level, once you know what kind of methods you're likely to be using yourself and what the shape of your data will be, what the format of your data will be, then the SHU Skills Centre, which is either you can find this by Googling SHU Skills Centre or you can access it from the Library Gateway. This is a really important resource for all students to access. It has bespoke resources, so if you click on the Find Skills Resources section there's lots of detailed information around different types of data analysis, kits, and approaches. But you can also book a session with an advisor to talk about your specific needs or attend a session. So there's loads of services there. So if there are elements of data analysis and presentation that you want to explore more, then that's the place to go. Thanks for listening, and I hope it's been helpful.